Without further ado, welcome to everybody. And first, we'd like to thank all of our panelists. We have somebody today representing the owner, architect, contractor, and product rep. So representing our owner is Brianne Tomlin, architect and facilities project manager of capital planning and construction at Renton School District number 403. Representing the architect, we have Kendall Williams, a senior associate at MG2. Representing the contractor, we have Kevin Ng, lead AP BD&C, associate DBIA, and chief estimator at GLY Construction. And representing the product rep, we have John Benyon, project manager at Interior Tech. All right. So we're just going to jump right in. So today we're talking about submittals, substitutions, and RFI. So starting with submittals, the definition there is product data, shop drawings, samples, and any other documents that are submitted by the general contractor to the architect to convey information about systems, products, and administrative matters. They serve as quality assurance for the project. So to start off, for all of our panelists, can you describe your typical process for creating and or reviewing a submittal? And do you involve anyone from outside of your typical CA team in the process of that review? So I guess, Brianne, if you want to start off.
Sure. Well, being on the owner side, my role is really to help facilitate our internal review of the submittal. Ideally after the contractor's already reviewed it, and ideally concurrently with architects and engineers. So my main focus is making sure my maintenance and custodial staff have a chance to see it and whether they have any questions they want raised during the submittal review process back to either engineers or contractors.
All right. And Kendall, how about you?
From my side, it's once we receive the submittal from the GC so we rarely ever create them. We always receive them. It's an internal review of first we check to see who actually needs to review it, whether it's my team's in my office or whether I have to send it out to the design team. And then from there, we determine whether it's actually matching the spec and if we have to reject it outright or if it's close and we have to have a discussion.
Mm-hmm. What, Kevin?
For me, the process starts before actually making the submittal. We need to make sure we're generating the right submittals for the project. And then the biggest thing is making a submittal schedule, so that way we have a clear idea of when submittals are needed. And one thing we really try to think about is leveling the submission of the submittals to the architect. And so that way their resources aren't strained in that process. And so, there's a lot of coordination of the whole project team to making submittals to make sure they're well coordinated. And then after that, though, once we establish the submittals that we need and the timeline we need them, we work with our trade partners to make sure we're generating the right submittals. And then we review them in-house. We incorporate all the information that we know from meeting with the design team, as well as their sub-consultants, whether it's, say an envelope consultant, to make sure we're incorporating all that information. And it's thoroughly reviewed before going to the architect.
Great. And how about you, John?
It's no wonder why we like working with GLY. A lot of what Kevin just said is part of the process. We're highlighting the specs to figure out what is specified, and then we're looking at our estimate or quote, and then it's communicating with the general contractor, typically to say, okay, this is our understanding. This is how we interpret the specifications, interpret the drawings, interpret the design intent, and then communicating that all in one, and then talking with the general contractor so that everyone's on the same page. I mean, it's really just trying to figure out, highlighting. Most manufacturers really don't give that good of information to you, and so we're trying to add to this, the shop drawings where it doesn't detail the little items that are needed. So it's kind of trying to paint a picture in a submittal, so it includes everything that's in the estimate.
Okay, great. And so for Brianne and Kendall, on your side, what would you see in a submittal that would make you want to reject it? or ask for major modifications?
On my end, it's really only if it would be something that was not that was submitted, not specified without a substitution request, or something that just flat out doesn't meet, my district standards that my maintenance team couldn't accept.
And for me, it basically follows those same lines. If it needs to follow the spec, and if it doesn't, it tends to get rejected. Beyond that, it's usually sorry. We tend to get a difference from the spec when, for some reason, the material is not available and we were not aware of it. Then it becomes a discussion about what is it we need to change in our specs so that we can use that material because it fits the parameters.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes sense. And kind of a question that wasn't on the list is a follow-up for you, both Kendall and Brianne, is I know when I go through and look at submittal, I'm a specifier on the education committee here, and I go through line by line to kind of say, does this match? Does that match? Is that your process as well, or do you take a different approach?
For me, it varies, I guess. If the material that's in the spec is what's in the submittal, then it tends to be fairly quick. So I just look I start with the material. Is the material the same? And then is the name of the material the same? As we start to move through it, I start to shorten the review. If going line by line after the first few lines, it is definitely not the same, then I have to pay more attention, and I'm starting looking at the details to make sure that the parameters are there.
Yeah, I would say that I usually, even if I'm doing a concurrent review, I would rely on the architects and engineers to have at least made a first pass to make sure that it's as complete as it needs to be for us to take a look.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then for all of you, when you prepare or review the average submittal, about how much time does that take? What complicates the process for you? And is there anything that you could receive from one of the other parties that would make that submittal review more efficient on your end? Let's start with Kendall because you're unmuted.
Okay. It will actually vary. If they're following the spec exactly, then it's less than a day. It's fast. If it requires me to send it out to my design team, then it will take longer because there's going to be a day for them to get it, and then a day for them to review it, and then for it to come back to me and for me to check and verify that they did it right. Because of the speed of the projects that I work on, we don't have a lot of time, so we tend to spend less. It should be in general less than a week, and hopefully about a day. And then what helps us out is if there's cut sheets, if the information we ask for in the spec is all there. A lot of times the spec will call for we'll ask for information about the product, and if that information isn't there, then we have to go back to the contractor and ask for it, so that will cause a delay. If the material is actually what is written in the spec exactly, then a lot of times we won't ask for it because it's following the spec in terms of the name of the product and the manufacturer, and so it kind of varies from submittal to submittal how we take care of that.
Okay. And Brianne, how long does it take on your side? Because you said you also sometimes reach out to facilities.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is on my end, it's mostly just waiting for those folks to be available when they're not out in the field. So it's less about the actual review time and more about just syncing up schedules. Usually if it's a product they've seen before, it's just a quick, head nod. Yeah, that looks good. And hopefully if it's a product they haven't seen before, we've done our vetting during design. So I guess I would say the helpful thing is if the architects and then if we have a GCCM partner on board can provide us with that information before we go to bid, it can always speed up the construction process.
And Kevin, how about on your end? Is there kind of a additional question to this. Is there anything you would like to see in the specs that would really help create those submittals in a better way? Or is there something that you're missing from us that you normally see?
No, I think again, it's just as long as the time's available to put in before we have to submit the specs. Usually the process is pretty clean. I know early in jobs, architects may not have ramped up their staff yet. So that's one where maybe the answer isn't trying to push all of these decisions and coordination early. So, we need to be thoughtful how we do that. But overall, the time really varies depending on what the submission is. Again, as Brienne and Kendall just mentioned, if it's just verifying we're truly speaking the same language, it can be pretty quick. But specs that involve coordination, if we're working with John and his company and getting shop drawings, as far as John's concerned, his component can be completely right. But as the general contractor, we need to make sure it's also coordinated with all the other elements, he's interfacing with, it's a steel overhead in the right spot to hold the operable partition, the joints line up with the architectural finish. And that takes time. So, to make sure that, the project goes smoothly, you got to invest up early and coordinate that.
Mm-hmm. And then John, how about for you? Because sometimes you guys will create the shop drawings and there's just a lot going on your end. How long does it normally take you to create documentation?
For a little tiny coiling door, it could be 30 minutes. For a school with 14 doors and they're all different sizes and shapes, and some are up walls and some are different, it could be 14 days. You have different finishes. Some might require samples. You might have some physical samples, not just colored samples. You have to be pre-ordered weeks in advance. And then you have third-party engineering sometimes required, which manufacturers are very limited on what they can provide when it comes to especially like school projects or university or state federal projects. A lot of them requiring stamped seismic, and that can be very limited with certain manufacturers. And so working through a third-party group just to get documentation before submittal could take weeks. So it really kind of varies on the project and size and what's there. But submittals can take very little energy or a lot. But the things that are going to affect you are working through third-party stuff, hard physical samples, and like Kevin said, coordinating what's actually there. So understanding where our product stops and the building begins. And that transition, how is it going to attach? How is it going to mount? Is there going to be a structural element, so like an opera wall that's hanging from the ceiling? That the structural element has to be correct, and if it's not, that's got to be detailed out in our submittal. So it really varies quite a bit, but it can take some time.
And so for that timing, would you work with somebody like Kevin, looking at the submittal schedule to see when that needs to start happening? Or what is that process when you decide when you need to start working on it or deliver it?
Typically, I'd say most contractors now are putting language in contracts that are detailing submittals in the first 14 days after contract. That's pretty common language. We're trying to get it done as quickly as possible after contract for that reason, and to get any additional items that are not in the drawings into the drawings, just so that happens in time. We're going as fast as we can. I'd say work with GOI, you're going to have submittals time actually into the construction schedule, and it's typically before any procurement, so you'll have that fairly early on. But a lot of contractors just work on the big stuff first. So interiors and interior subcontractors often get their submittals pushed back a ways. So we'll see it after concrete, curtain wall, insulation, that kind of stuff. Those subs will go first, and then they'll come back to us and say, okay, now we need you. And we will raise our hand early on if we have to and say, okay, wait a minute. I saw your construction schedule. You need this in July. My submittal needs attention. Like, we need this back. And so we try our best to stay in front of lead times, especially, long during the pandemic. Some lead times stretched out over 6 months for products. So it was, if we needed to raise our hand and say, submittals need attention now, we will. But yeah, I think that answers it.
All right. Um, are there any submittal types? I guess this is more of a question for Kevin and John, but are there any submittal types that are, John mentioned some of a few of them already, but the things are they're really difficult to receive or to create that you don't necessarily find as kind of necessarily a value add, where there's an alternative that you'd recommend instead?
This is probably not exactly answering the question.
Oh, that's fine.
But I think everything has value. I think one of the challenges we face is, the industry is rapidly evolving, especially in certain, subjects such as like sustainability. The Pacific Northwest area is a leader, and it's great that we have clients and design teams that are pushing for these changes. But often we may find that, say, on the manufacturer side, they just may not be ready to fulfill that commitment. I think, as an example, EPDs are something that we see requested on most of our projects, and for certain product types, they just haven't gotten to the spot where they've developed EPDs for much of their catalog. It's changing, it's evolving, and that's great. But I'd say this point in time, we may not fully have those things available to us. So again, it's a discussion where we have to have something early and setting expectations on, how, as a team, do we want to meet this goal of our clients, and what is truly available to us to actually do that.
Right. And John, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, it is difficult that as the industry's changed, a lot of manufacturers have not caught up, and you're also finding a lot of manufacturers use that to their advantage to get specified and onto projects. And so it's for us, it's kind of a balance between the two. A lot of times we submit something that we think is a voluntary alternate that is in our eyes and on paper completely the same, but there might be a tinge something different, or a rating that it's achievable on this product or not another. And then you dive into it and you realize that that rating was available not by that manufacturer, but on this model type from that manufacturer up to this size only. But it's not on all their products, and so there's a lot of that kind of happening in the industry as well, where people are providing products on certain models and certain types and certain things, but not on everything. And you see that just flow into specifications because people really want them. For example, NFRC ratings, right, on exterior insulated doors. Well, there's very limited products that have that, but it's very common now for that to come into building envelope requirements. And you're not going to put that door on this location at this usage, but you want that rating, so it ends up in the spec. So we work with that a lot as manufacturers are trying to catch up to kind of what's being required here in Seattle. I mean, a lot of this stuff just isn't built here. A lot of it's built elsewhere, and that requirement's not the same as it is in Texas or New York as it would be here in Seattle or Oregon and California, because we're just a little bit ahead in terms of code and specs. So those things are troublesome. We try to work around, try to explain what the availability is, and then really work with the general contractor so everyone kind of knows that we're not trying to pull a fast one, but certain things just aren't available yet. And so we try to explain that as best we can.
Okay. And then this is the same topic, but a little off topic almost. For Kendall and Bran, when it comes to certain samples, I see a lot of pushback on things like non-customized products, like acoustical ceiling panels and grids, things that are very standardized, or on some specifications just ask for a certification from the manufacturer saying that the product meets requirements. And a lot of times the manufacturer will say, well, that's what our product data does. And I'm just wondering, what do you see value in those types? How do you use those two things, this very standard submittal or sample types and things like the certifications?
Yeah, for me, the big thing is to make sure that the warranty is correct. Beyond that, you know, if it's like a standard ceiling grid, there isn't really a lot of value for me as the owner to have a copy of the sample. I know that like we used to have like 3 sets of samples, and it would be one for the architect and one for the owner, and one to stay in the job trailer. I don't know that that's as valuable as maybe it once was, especially on that stuff. Like if we have it in all of our schools, there doesn't do me any good to see another set of it. But I will want to make sure that the warranty is correct and any other changes to the product data that are, you know, fairly recent.
And I think very much like that. We don't, if it's a standard product and we've used it in buildings everywhere, then I really don't need to see a sample. But if it's something unique that's in that building, either it's because of a pattern or because of a color, then we would want to see it just to make sure that it is indeed the right item. Beyond that, it's we try to feed to the conformance spec so that we don't have to see that stuff.
Yeah, I would say anything that has a dye lot attached to it. You know, you mentioned specific colors. We would want to see, like, especially if we're doing a remodel at an existing school, or especially if we're trying to match a school color, and that would go for a variety of types of clients. If you're trying to match a logo or something, you want to make sure that the dye lot is what you thought it was when you saw it during design.
And we also add paint to that, because paint will vary just enough that you actually need to see the color to make sure the color we named is the color that they're giving us, and that they name it correctly and that it actually matches what we think it is.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we're actually going to jump really quickly over to substitutions. I have a lot more questions for you, but we're going to have to wait for another time for those. All right, for substitutions, the definition is that it's something that replaces what was specified. So a substitution request is a form submitted by the GC to the architect proposing a change in the contract documents. Changes can be about a manufacturer, product, material system, etc. So before we even jump into the topic, Brianne, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because I think that you might work in different project types than a lot of others. Can you tell me a little bit about the pre-bid versus post-bid substitution requests? And then there's another question to this that we got in the chat, is that sometimes they'll run into areas where the architect will generate their own substitution form, and wondering if submitting maybe a standard AIA form instead is acceptable, because I know for school districts, there's usually very specific stuff. So there's a bunch of questions. Sorry.
Yeah, so let's see. So I think most public agencies have a very robust set of front end, you know, Division 0 and Division 1 specs that cover a lot of that, with a pre-bid. Well, it's got a substitution request form that can be used pre-bid and post-bid. For me, a pre-bid substitution is always easier to consider, because then we don't have to get into, well, not saying we wouldn't get into discussions of schedule, but at that point, we don't have to necessarily get into discussions of cost, because the bids haven't been submitted yet. And so if we approve it, we're saying that the price that you give us is what we've agreed to. If it comes in post-bid, then not only do we have to talk about schedule, but we have to talk about whether there's a cost benefit. And most public agencies are subject to rules about gifts of public funds and other things, and the lines there just get really blurry about what you can accept. If there's a cost benefit to the contractor, but they're not passing that along, that can be considered a gift of public funds, and that can be an audit problem later on. So it just gets really weird, and so it's much easier for us to consider it up front, because our contract language is written in such a way that if it comes in during construction, we're not really at any obligation to consider it. And so often I've seen project managers just put a really hard line and say, this is going to be too much paperwork. I'm not at an obligation to consider it unless you really have shown me you can do the due diligence and you really cannot get the other product, or there's, you know, a significant schedule risk. We'd much rather consider it if you know about it early, before, you know, you give us either a bid or a final GMP.
Right.
Did I touch on all your various questions?
I think so.
Okay.
Sorry, I know I ask a lot all at once, just a little too much stream of thought sometimes. Kendall, kind of following up on a portion of that with the substitution request form. If somebody submits a form that is not the one that you had in the spec for maybe a non-hard bid project, is that something that you would still consider, or would you just reject it outright, or does it really depend on the circumstance?
Probably depends on the circumstance. In general, I would reject it outright and tell them to use the form that was provided in the spec.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the assumption is that that substitution is coming through the GC, which means he or she would already know what the right form is, and they would deal with that on their side before I actually see it.
Okay.
And I wanted to clarify, I saw a question in the chat about potential substitutions before bidding. I guess when I'm saying pre-bid, what I mean is between the time that the project is advertised for bid and when the bids are due. So I'm not talking about during the design phase. I'm talking about that short time between when it's out, available for bidders to review, but before the bids are due.
And I know to dovetail on that, in my specs, it's actually stated that the substitution needs to be made during the bid process. And that they risk having it rejected if it's done during construction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, so Kevin and John, can you tell me a little bit about when you would propose a substitution request, the different circumstances behind those?
So typically my involvement's, you know, during the pre-construction phase. And so again, it's trying to work towards alignment with the design and our client's goals. You know, the first thing we need to establish is, you know, what is best value for the project. And it may be for some scope of work, the best value is this very specific thing that the architect has chosen. They've chosen it for a reason. It has a unique experience to the occupants and those who engage it, and that's what the project needs. But for a lot of scopes, best value is making sure that we can, you know, tap into the full resources of our trade partners, you know, and making sure that the project's available for them to pursue. You know, as an example, something I'll see, say curtain wall, will see a product spec, but say for this given project, the best value might be accessing certain trade partners who either don't use that product or provide their own proprietary system. And so this is, again, a discussion we have to have with the design team and with the client, you know, to make sure we're moving down the right path and that these are the folks that we want to engage because we view that they are the right fit for the job. And then we need to align the specs to make sure that no one's precluded from that standpoint. So, you know, usually we try to focus on performance requirements, you know, kind of tangible data. We use products maybe as a reference point to compare against, but ultimately we want to make sure that we can engage as many, you know, potential people as possible that are right and qualified for the project.
Yeah, I would say that the substitution request for us, it's depends on the type of project it is. So if you're a school project or a hard bid project, we're going to have to get a substitution request done just before we even provide the quote, because we don't want to take the risk of having to buy someone else's product, right? So we're gonna get that early on before even providing a bid. But like Kevin was saying, a lot of the stuff that we're doing for substitution requests are clarifying what's available, clarifying usage. Hey, you know what? The specification said that you needed this gauge on this particular product. Well, it's not available because the opening's too big. The gauge has to increase, or now it's too heavy, so the gauge has to come down. So a lot of that is clarifying kind of what's available and being usage, and that kind of substitution request typically happens after contract, working through like a design process, and in tandem with the general contractor.
Yeah, one thing I'll add is, typically design teams, specifiers, they have access to product reps, and they do a very good job of, providing information on their product. But what we, as contractors also need to layer onto it is not just the product itself, but its installed form, its finished product. And that's where we need folks like John, interior tech, to help translate us, not just this is a good product, the right product, but how does it actually install into the application we need? And what are the things that your team is affected by using this product, or maybe potential alternates? And that's what we, again, would try to communicate back to the design team and the client on why we would want a substitution.
Yeah, no, that's great, because one of the big things that is concerning for a lot of designers is making sure that that due diligence is done, because it can be such a risk. And it sounds like you guys are doing it. And just wondering, for maybe situations where you don't have a very deep relationship with the manufacturer, the provider, how might that due diligence situation look a little different? And for Kendall and Brianne, how do you, I guess, what is the best way to put this? How do you feel comfortable knowing that enough due diligence has been done on the substitution requests? Is there something that you see directly from the contractor or in that request itself? So I guess, Kevin, I'll start with you, and then we can go forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that, because usually all our projects, we're working from a place of trust and relationships. Really, I mean, the only answer is you just got to put the work into to know your trade partners and invest time in learning the items and asking questions on, and when there is information that's needed, and not just blindly accepting something. But ultimately, if we're suggesting items that don't serve the project well, we're not going to get repeat business. So I don't know.
All right. So Brianne and Kendall, you maybe in that case have a little more experience with those, receiving something that is, you're not sure if all of the due diligence has happened. What would you do? How do you feel comfortable accepting that substitution request?
Want to start, Kendall?
Start, sure. It all depends. I think most of the projects I work on, we're working with contractors that we've worked with before. So we've been working with them for 5, 10, 15 years. So we have built up a trust. When it comes to a substitution that's for a product that they say is unavailable, we will actually also call that manufacturer to verify that it's not, because that kind of thing affects not only the project the current project, but it will affect other projects that are in the pipeline. So we need to know that so that we can change the spec so that this doesn't happen to other people. And then I think it's also, how much information did they give us? Is there enough information in the request in order for us to make a decision? Sometimes you can tell whether they've made the effort to give you what you need versus they just really just want to use this other person. So you can usually tell by how they filled out the form and whether they provided the cut sheets and photos and data and things like that we would need to actually make the decision.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, if you've been given a clear description of the reason why, and for me, that's helpful. So, we're increasingly working with GCCM process. And so we're working with repeat contractors and folks we have a relationship with, but this would go for a design bid build contractor also. Start the conversation early as soon as you know about it. Like, hey, there might be a substitution in the pipeline. So as long as you've been provided with a clear description of the problem, whether it's schedule or, availability, or just, something was spec'd incorrectly, and a clear description of the schedule impact or benefit, and a clear description of the cost impact or benefit. I think if you have those three things, you feel like you can make a comprehensive decision on whether or not you think it will benefit the project.
Okay, great.
On the, if I could add something, it's as the being the subcontractor or the manufacturer rep, in sense, when we submit stuff like this, I think what's really helpful is we try to be professionals of the stuff that we do and represent, but present enough knowledge of the other product as well. Because using an example that was brought up earlier, warranties. A lot of times warranties come into specs that just aren't available, or are available differently from different manufacturers. So we come in and say, we've got a similar product, but the warranty is different. A lot of times what I end up saying is, but here's the warranty information from the manufacturer specified. It also is different. So we try to present as much information as possible so that people can have some trust in what you're giving them. Because if you just say, hey, my product's different, and we of course don't know the cost difference because we're not the other guy. So we don't know what the cost difference is. Only the general contractor can tell you that, because if we're low bid, we're low bid. It's really hard to convey that. So we try really hard to present our information as well as much information out there about what we are substituting from, so that what we're presenting is trustworthy. Like that's sometimes the way of bridging that gap.
Well, yeah, and I think you just touched on a good thing, which is that the general contractor is the one that needs to understand the cost difference. And I would feel much better about a substitution request if I felt that the general had a really robust understanding of the change and not just passing through something from a sub tier, which doesn't happen very often, but has happened in the past.
Mhm. Yeah, and so actually that warranty note brings up a really good question about limiting competition for things that may or may not be available by the manufacturers who are specified, or the other manufacturers. And so sometimes the substitutions will come from that. And where do you see that happening? And what have you come across anything to really solve that, where there are unintentional kind of sole sourcing or reduced sourcing?
For me,
I think it's really a question for everybody, but I think, John, you're probably the most appropriate person to start first.
yeah, warranty, it's a tough one, because it is something used for spec purposes, especially when you have warranties that'll be taken from an item that's being provided. For example, a door that operates, that motor has a warranty, the finish has a warranty, the product has a warranty. All those are different. And then typically you'll see a spec that says, say, 5-year warranty. Well, that's only the motor. That's not the finish. That's not the product. But it says 5-year. That's flat across. So we try very hard to be able to say, look, that's not available in the industry. Industry standards this. If you want 5-year, basically most manufacturers just double the cost. So the cost to replace the product at cost at a later date. And it's very expensive that way. So we try to get through these items and to be able to say things like, okay, I can give you this on that. I can not give you on that warranty on this, and try to show what an industry standard is. I came across a sectional door just 2 months ago with a 20-year warranty. And the way I tried to present it was I got that manufacturer's warranty and showed that it was only on the finish, and it was a limited finish warranty only from Sherwin-Williams. And of that warranty, it said could not be used in a dusty environment. So I figured that middle school had a dusty environment and that this should just go away. So, but it's very common. I feel like it's important to be flexible and trust the people you're working with and working with on warranties, because there's a lot of differences out there in the market.
Yeah. Any of the other panelists have a thought on it, or did John kind of cover it all?
Yeah, I
Seeing
think he
lots
covered.
nodding.
Yeah, I think he covered it. I think what we've done, especially when you have a repeat client, is that a lot of the sole sourced materials are under a national account. So the client has already talked to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer should be providing it. So we have less problems with that kind of thing. In terms of other ones, we go to the or equal, which is why we go back to and look at and to look to make sure that the product being sent to us matches what's in the spec in terms of its in terms of its color, its size, its all of its parameters, to make sure that those match. So it's less about a specific manufacturer. It's more about, does their product match what we are looking for?
Okay, great. And so I think we have one more question under substitutions that was actually in the comments. So as best practice, do the panelists believe that there is an appropriate quantity of approved manufacturers or products to list in a given spec section, especially public project, to give bidding contractors sufficient options to minimize or avoid bidding substitutions and any potential faulty due diligence?
Yeah, I can jump on that one. I don't know that there's like a best practice number out there. I would say a good rule of thumb, if you really want to get some good price competition, is probably 3. What we've done in the past, where we just really truly don't feel like we have 3 products in the market that fit our, use needs, whether that's maintenance or other factors, is we'll just remove those from the spec and well, not remove them from the spec, but we'll go ahead and bid those as alternates. So we'll bid the product as, like, say, assume there's no carpet. And then if we only have 2 carpet manufacturers, we would bid carpet manufacturer A as alternate A and carpet manufacturer B as alternate B. And then we just add whichever one is most appropriate back into the project as an alternate acceptance. So that's something we can do as a public owner. If we just don't have 3 manufacturers that we can really get behind.
And Kevin, do you see a specific number where competitive bidding gets a little bit easier versus a little harder? Is there kind of an over/under?
Well, I think 3 is a good number.
Okay.
3 lets you triangulate information. If you just have 2, then it's hard to tell which one is the truth versus starting to see a trend. At the same time, you don't necessarily want too much. You want people to be invested in your project and put in the effort. And if I'm thinking of going out to trade partners, if the number's too many, I may not get people's best efforts too. So there's a right number of providing a competitive environment, but still making sure that it's worth it to people to invest in the job.
Okay. Great. So we're going to switch over to the RFI. And so RFI are requests for interpretation, a form requesting. So it's a form requesting interpretation of the documents or to request information that might be missing. So a study that people still reference all the time is by Navigant Consulting back in 2013. And it found that the average RFI takes a combined 8 hours of work from the creation to the response and back and forth. Just wondering if this is still the case, because this is obviously 11 years later. How much time does it take each one of you to deal with kind of a typical RFI? I guess maybe let's do John, Kevin, Kendall, and Brianne.
Typical RFI, it's a loaded question. So a typical RFI could be, it could be an hour or a conference call. It really could vary significantly for us. The most important, the intent of it is to make it a contract document so that everyone's on the same page, that we expect either to clarify something we've done and or anticipate a potential cost impact, so that everyone wants to have that document followed. And to convey that is typically a conversation with the general contractor, because we do anticipate that potential cost impact or a clarification document that we are presenting. So I guess what I'm starting to say is there's no real, hey, if I do this RFI, it should take me an hour. I can't really say that because it's a little more than that. And so obviously you need to put a lot of thought into it before you go to the contractor and then present it out. I mean, typing it out doesn't take very much time, but it's all the other stuff. Sorry, that's not really an answer, but
No, I mean, that kind of answer is the truth. So, like, how else would you answer it? Yeah. How about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I think the goal would be what would be an easy RFI is you've addressed it before you even got to the CD documents, coordinating with the design team, and there was a missing dimensions or just language clarification that was done, and it never becomes an RFI. And so usually when you actually get to an RFI, it's an issue that needs lots of input, a lot of coordination, consultants, trade partners to weigh in. Usually it comes up from something, say, maybe a authority having jurisdiction, a field inspector, kind of putting something on the project that was new, or maybe two trade partners that don't normally interface or interfacing on this job, and there's just some uniqueness on how they come together. And it could take quite a bit of time, just to make sure that a solution is fully developed. So yeah, I think RFIs can take a while.
Boy, yeah. As John said, and as Kevin said, that it could be quick. We've had RFIs that we can respond to in 15 minutes. It's the question made sense. The contractor provided the information we needed in order to track down the answer, meaning they gave us a snippet of the drawing and circled it and said, we need this. And it's a dimension. Those are quick. When they're about a product or about a way of constructing a way of constructing something, those will take longer. Hope is that there has been a phone call ahead of the RFI so that we know what's coming. That will shorten the RFI response because we already know what's coming. Sometimes we're able to actually answer the RFI on the phone and there isn't one. Other times we're able to answer it on the phone, but we ask for it. But I've asked the contractor to send me the RFI just so that we can track that this was a problem, and we can then take that information and bring it through all the projects so that that question will go away. So again, it varies. And then there's also the ones where you send it to your design team. So it may only take them half an hour to answer it, but for you to get the response may take a day or 2 days because they're doing other things. So there's a lot of factors that will actually cause that RFI to either be really short or really long that we can't control.
Yeah, and I would say one way to have the resolution go faster is make sure your client is involved in that conversation, because I've been a part of some where I wasn't a part of some very lengthy back and forth conversations on a design change, and then when they send the RFI to me for kind of like final review, it's not something we could ever accept in our project. And here, the civil engineers just spent 4 days working on a proposed revision or something. So, and then it's happened the other way too, where there's been it's been very quick and we all just agree, yes, let's move forward. So just my recommendation would be, don't put yourself in a lengthy RFI conversation that isn't even going to be considered once it's all said and done.
Yeah. And this would be a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just going to add something I learned in my good old GOI days was you don't write an RFI, I was told, and I practice this today. You don't write an RFI that has an open question. Bring a solution. An RFI means you've actually researched it. Like there's a direction or a path. So typically I love finishing my questions with more of a please confirm. Like we have a path, there is a solution. This is what we're trying to achieve. Like not just, hey, there's a problem. Because no one likes that.
Yeah, no, those are great. So Kendall, there's a question in the comments saying, under which circumstances would you accept a verbal RFI rather than asking for a written one?
That, I actually saw that, and I think the easy answer is the contractor has called up and said they can't find where one of the HVAC units is listed in the mechanical drawings, and I pop open the mechanical drawings and I find it and I tell them where it is. There's no reason for a written RFI because the information is already in the documents. They just, for some reason, didn't see it. That's when I wouldn't want a written one because what's the point?
Yeah, makes sense. All right,
No,
and so
I don't know if this is on topic, but I was thinking about that when Kendall was talking. And this is a lot of times we have the source of information. Say we have a Revit model that has the information we need. The challenge is the Revit model is not a contract document. And so we need to make an RFI and invest time to do that just to make sure contractually we're all buttoned up. And I just keep wondering, if there's an opportunity down the road to save time in that department and use some of these coordination tools we have and turn them into contract pieces. Anyways, just something I was thinking about.
No, that's a great point. And Kevin, that actually leads right into the next attendee question is for everybody, but how are you balancing answering RFI and BIM changes elsewhere in the project? Is the RFI answer adequate, or do you expect multiple RFI to be addressed and then a subsequent ASI issue to bring the drawings up to date? And then to add to that is really when it comes to BIM and RFI changes, is one leading the other? It's heavy. It's a lot of stuff all at once.
I'll start with my how I was taught, which was if you are changing the contract, an RFI is not a contract change document. And therefore you must follow up with a CCD or an ASI to officially change the contract. Now, in today's world where the GC is maybe managing the BIM model and it's being kept real time in Procore, it gets a little bit squishy about who's actually issuing that document. But
I think to add to that, with what I do, I either issue. Yes, I agree that the RFI is really not a change in the contract. It just answers a question. We typically follow that up with what we call a PR, which is different than an ASI. In my opinion, an ASI means, hey, here's the information. We've updated the drawings. It's a no cost item. I issue a PR because I believe it's going to be a cost item and that's going to eventually turn into a COP change order and change the contract. That's sort of how I look at the two between an ASI and a PR. I used to just assume that the RFI, that the GC would submit a contract change based upon the RFI, but more and more GCs are not doing that. They actually want us to change the drawings so that they can issue the change order based upon an actual drawing change that they can track. And we tend to gather those up. We don't issue a PR every time there's an RFI. We tend to gather those and issue it once because sometimes you can have 100 RFIs on a project, or depending on how big the project is, 1,000. You don't want 1,000 contract changes. You want to minimize that number as much as possible. Nobody wants any changes.
Yeah, I think it really depends on, what the scope is. I mean, the ultimate goal is to be efficient communicators, to be clear communicators, and to use our time efficiently. I can see early in a project where our RFIs are maybe actually doing some heavy lifting of coordinating and clarifying items. You don't necessarily want to try to coordinate and then communicate a job to trade partners with a handful of RFIs. It would be really nice. Okay, we've got to this point. Let's just clean it up with an ASI. And now we know we're communicating on the same thing, but certainly, down the road, if I'm asking for dimensions, we're maintaining our own BIM model, and that's what we're building on. We have the info, we have an RFI. Eventually, it can be wrapped up into a owner change order, but that's not really what our risk is. We have all the tools we need to communicate information. So.
All right, and we have way more questions for you than we have time allotted. So,
actually, Melissa, I
yeah.
apologize. I have
Yep,
to.
I know you've got to take off. So,
one more question before I go, or
yeah. So just a conclusion question for everybody is: do you have any final recommendations regarding submittals, substitution, RFI, or other CA documents that you'd like to see more people enact? And Kevin, if you want to give a one-word answer before jumping off, that sounds great.
I don't know one word, but
Yeah.
coordination and language. I think when it comes to specifications, information could say come from a lot of different spots, and just making sure we're all on the same page. Casework, is it Division 12 or 6, or this, landscaping guardrail, is it spec by Division 5 or Division 32? Each one of those, it might be clear to someone, but it's an opportunity for another party to misinterpret, and ultimately something has to get resolved for a successful job. And so I just thinking about those things and the language that we talk about and being specific matters. Anyways, thanks everyone.
Thank you
Sorry.
so much, Kevin. Appreciate it. All right, so Brianne, Kendall, and John, same question for you. Is there any kind of takeaway you would like people to take from here? What can they do to make this documentation better?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, sorry. I know people have the inclination or desire to make things generic and very broad to allow more things into the spec. I think that's appropriate in a lot of cases. I run into the problem where typically where if you make a spec too broad, I think it needs to follow what your design intent is. And the spec really should amplify your intent for that product or finish or whatever it might be. When you make things broad, you end up, as my coworkers and I call, all the things. You want all the things. I can't quote all the things, and I can't provide all the things. And so really understanding what your intent is in a spec I think is really important. And what if you're certain things that are desired or wanted, those need to be clearly stated above all, so that the right thing can happen. If you leave things generic, it complicates things. You're not going to get more bids. You're probably going to get less. You're going to get less help because people don't know the direction you're going.
Yeah, I actually just I was going to say the same thing. I was going to say clarity if I had to pick one word. I just ran into that, 2 different projects by 2 different designers, and one had a very clear kind of roles and responsibilities chart for the owner side and the subcontractor side, and the installation was almost perfect. And then the other one just had some very generic language about installation, and nothing happened. And so, there's always time. If you want to be more specific, you can call out to the owner or to the architect and say, hey, I've put very specific language in here. Spend some time making sure it's right. And that time spent will probably be less time than you spend arguing about it during construction.
I would say to add on to all that is get your submittals in as early as possible. Don't wait till the last minute, because sometimes there are things that have really long lead items like fire pumps that could be 4 or 5 months, and you may not have that time. So make sure you get those in early. Knowing that RFIs, sometimes they are last minute, meaning it's after bid. Try to make sure that the team, especially on the construction side, is doing their 2-week look ahead, so they know what part of the building they're going to work on, and get those RFIs out ahead of time. There's nothing worse than getting an RFI at the moment that they need the answer, and it's going to take you 2 days to answer it, and now the whole team is sitting. That doesn't do anybody any good. And there are times when we miss stuff, or that we assume everybody knows where that wall sits, and then we realize later, oh crap, we missed a dimension. There's no way the contractor can know where that wall is. So we all make those mistakes. But if you can help, if the teams are trying to help each other get the building built, we can get those questions answered early enough that it doesn't cause a problem.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So thank you all. We really, really appreciate it. So just a reminder of who these people were representing the owner. We had Brianne Tomlin, who is the Facilities Project Manager, Capital Planning and Construction at Renton School District, number 403. Kendall Williams representing the architect. He's a Senior Associate at MG2. We have our contractor, Kevin Ing, who is the Chief Estimator at GLY Construction. And our product rep was John Benyon, Project Manager at Interior Tech. So thank you. We really, really appreciate it. I'm seeing some comments in here saying thank you for the great discussion. We really appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.